Widowed cowboy found a native girl tied to a stone when she removed her sack. It was his first love. James Thornton sat on his old wooden porch, staring out at the vast Montana landscape that stretched before him like an endless brown and gold carpet. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying with it the loneliness that had become his constant companion. 3 years had passed since Sarah died. 3 long years that felt like a lifetime. His wife had been a good woman, kind and patient, who had stood by him through droughts, harsh winters, and the endless work that came with running a cattle ranch. But pneumonia had taken her one brutal winter, and since then the ranch that once echoed with her laughter and the smell of her cooking had become nothing more than a shell of memories. James was 58 years old now, his face weathered by decades under the Montana sun, his hands calloused from years of hard work. His dark hair had turned mostly gray, and deep lines creased his forehead and the corners of his eyes. He had always been a strong man, both in body and spirit, but grief had a way of wearing down even the strongest souls. Most days he went through the motions of ranch work mechanically, feeding the cattle, mending fences, and checking the water sources. But there was no joy in it anymore, no purpose beyond simple survival. The autumn of 1887 had arrived with its usual display of changing colors. The cottonwood trees along the creek had turned golden, and the air carried that crisp coolness that promised winter was not far behind. On this particular October morning, James had woken before dawn as he always did, and prepared a simple breakfast of coffee and leftover cornbread. Several of his cattle had wandered off toward the eastern boundary of his property, near where his land met the Crow Reservation. It was not unusual for the animals to stray, searching for better grazing, but he needed to bring them back before they caused any problems with his native neighbors. He saddled his horse, a reliable chestnut mare named Copper, and set out across his property as the sun began to paint the eastern sky with shades of pink and orange. The morning was peaceful, with only the sound of Copper's hooves against the earth and the occasional call of a crow breaking the silence. James had always found a certain comfort in these early morning rides, a time when he could be alone with his thoughts, though lately those thoughts had been darker than he would have liked. After riding for about an hour, he spotted several of his cattle grazing near a rocky outcrop that marked the informal boundary between his land and tribal territory. He was guiding them back toward his property when he heard something that made him pull Copper to a sudden stop. It was a sound that did not belong in this quiet wilderness, a muffled cry that seemed almost human. At first he thought perhaps he had imagined it, that his lonely mind was playing tricks on him. But then he heard it again, clearer this time, definitely the sound of someone in distress. James dismounted quickly and tied Copper to a low shrub. His heart began to beat faster as he moved toward the rocky outcrop, his boots crunching on the dry grass and scattered stones. The sound was coming from behind a large boulder, partially hidden from view. As he rounded the rock, the sight that met his eyes made him stop in his tracks, shock and horror flooding through him. A woman was tied to a smaller stone, her arms bound behind her back with rough rope that had cut into her wrists, leaving marks of dried blood. Her legs were also tied, and, most striking of all, a dirty burlap sack had been placed over her head, covering her face completely. She was dressed in traditional native clothing, a deerskin dress that was torn and stained with dirt. From her muffled sounds and the way her body trembled, James could tell she had been there for many hours, possibly through the entire cold night. Hold on, James said, his voice rough with emotion as he rushed to her side. He pulled out his knife and began carefully cutting the ropes that bound her. His hands, steady from years of ranch work, moved quickly but carefully, not wanting to hurt her further. You're safe now. I'm going to help you. The woman's muffled cries turned to quiet sobs as she felt the ropes loosening. James worked on the bindings around her wrists first, wincing as he saw how deeply the rope had cut into her skin. Whoever had done this had meant for her to suffer, had meant for her to die out here alone in the wilderness where no one would find her. The thought filled him with rage, but he pushed it down, focusing instead on freeing this poor soul. Once her hands were free, he moved to untie her legs. The woman's hands immediately went to the sack covering her head, but she seemed too weak to remove it herself. Her fingers trembled as they pulled at the rough fabric. James set down his knife and reached up to help her, gently grasping the bottom of the sack. "Let me help you with that," he said softly. "Easy now." He carefully lifted the burlap sack from her head, pulling it up slowly so as not to startle her. As the fabric came away and the woman's face was revealed to the morning light, James felt his entire world tilt on its axis. The sack fell from his suddenly nerveless fingers, dropping to the ground forgotten. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He took an involuntary step backward, his legs suddenly weak, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were showing him. The woman before him was native, her skin the color of warm copper, Her long black hair streaked with gray and tangled around her face. She was breathing heavily, her dark eyes squinting against the sudden brightness of daylight. Her face was lined with age and hardship, the skin around her eyes creased with wrinkles that spoke of both laughter and tears. She appeared to be in her mid-50s, perhaps a bit younger, though hard living could age a person beyond their years. But it was not just any face. Despite the passage of more than 3 decades, despite the marks that time and suffering had left upon her features, James recognized her. He recognized her as surely as he recognized his own reflection in a mirror, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her cheekbones, the way her mouth turned down slightly at the corners, even the small scar above her left eyebrow that she had gotten falling from a tree as a child. "Little Sparrow," he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a prayer, like a ghost from a past he thought was buried forever. The woman's eyes, which had been unfocused and confused, suddenly sharpened. They locked onto James's face with an intensity that took his breath away. Her cracked lips parted, and a single word escaped, barely audible but clear enough. "James?" He fell to his knees beside her, his mind reeling. This was impossible. Little Sparrow, the crow girl he had loved with all the passion and intensity of youth more than 30 years ago. The girl he had been forced to leave behind when her father forbade their relationship and circumstances drove him back east. The girl he had never forgotten, even after he married Sarah, even after he built a life that had nothing to do with those 2 magical summers by the river. "You need water," he managed to say, forcing himself to focus on immediate needs rather than the thousands of questions flooding his mind. He reached for his canteen, which hung from his belt, and unscrewed the cap with shaking hands. "Here, drink slowly." He held the canteen to her lips, supporting her head with his other hand. Little Sparrow drank greedily at first, then coughed, water spilling down her chin. James pulled the canteen back slightly. "Slow, slow," he said gently. "Not too fast or you'll make yourself sick." She nodded weakly and drank again, this time in small sips. James could see that she was severely dehydrated, her lips cracked and bleeding, her skin dry and tight. She had been left here to die. There was no doubt about that. Left tied up in the wilderness where the cold night air, dehydration, and exposure would have killed her within another day, perhaps sooner. As she drank, her eyes never left his face, studying him with the same shock and disbelief that he felt. He knew he looked different from the young man she had known, that James had been 20 years old, full of dreams and energy, his face unlined and his body strong from youth rather than hard labor. The James kneeling before her now was nearly 60, his face marked by weather and time, his body still strong but in the way of a man who had worked hard all his life rather than the easy strength of youth. "Is it really you?" she whispered when she had drunk enough. Her voice was hoarse, damaged from hours of crying out for help that never came. "It's me," James confirmed, his own voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe, Little Sparrow, what happened? Who did this to you?" But even as he asked the question, he knew this was not the time for explanations. She was weak, possibly injured beyond what he could see, and she needed proper care. The story of how she came to be tied to this rock, left to die in the wilderness, and why fate had brought him to find her, could wait. "Can you stand?" he asked. "My horse is just over there. I need to get you somewhere safe, get you warm and fed." Little Sparrow tried to push herself up, but her legs gave out beneath her. James caught her before she could fall, his arms going around her to support her weight. She was lighter than he expected, too light, as if she had not been eating properly for some time, even before this ordeal. "I've got you," he said firmly. "Put your arms around my neck." She did as he instructed, her arms weak but managing to hold on. James lifted her carefully, one arm under her knees and the other supporting her back, and carried her toward where Copper waited patiently. The horse nickered softly as they approached, as if sensing something significant was happening. Getting Little Sparrow onto the horse while she was so weak proved challenging, but James managed it, climbing up first and then pulling her up to sit in front of him. She leaned back against his chest, her body trembling from exhaustion and cold. James wrapped his coat around her shoulders and turned Copper toward home. As they rode slowly back across the grassland, James's mind was a whirlwind of emotions and questions. Little Sparrow, his first love, the girl who had taught him to read animal tracks and understand the language of the wind, the girl whose laughter had been like music and whose eyes had held all the mysteries of the world. She was here, in his arms, after more than 30 years. She was alive, though someone had tried very hard to ensure she would not be. The sun climbed higher in the sky as they rode, and James felt the weight of Little Sparrow's head as it came to rest against his shoulder. She had fallen into an exhausted sleep, her body finally relaxing now that she was safe. He held her carefully, making sure she would not fall, and guided Copper with gentle pressure from his knees. His ranch house appeared in the distance, small and lonely-looking on the vast prairie. James had never been so grateful to see it. Whatever had brought Little Sparrow back into his life, whatever circumstances had led to her being tied to that stone, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would not let any more harm come to her, not while he still drew breath. The ride back to the ranch felt both endless and far too short. James held Little Sparrow carefully as Copper walked at a steady pace across the prairie. Every few minutes he would glance down at her face, still unable to fully believe that she was real, that this was actually happening. Her breathing had become more regular as she slept against his chest, exhausted from her ordeal. The morning sun grew warmer and birds began their daily songs, but James barely noticed any of it. His mind had traveled back in time, pulled into memories he had kept locked away for decades. It had been the spring of 1854 when James first arrived in Montana Territory. He was 20 years old then, fresh from Pennsylvania, hired by a surveying company to help map the expanding western territories. Back east, his family had expected him to become a lawyer like his father, to settle into a comfortable life in Philadelphia. But James had always dreamed of the West, of wide-open spaces and adventure. Against his father's wishes, he had signed on with the surveying expedition, packed his bags, and headed into what was then considered wild, untamed country. Those first few months had been difficult. The work was hard, the weather unpredictable, and the landscape unlike anything he had known. The other surveyors were rough men, experienced in frontier life, and they had little patience for an educated city boy who did not know how to track game or start a fire in the rain. James had felt lost and out of place, questioning whether he had made a terrible mistake in coming west. Then came the trading gathering in late June. The surveying company had sent James and two others to a large meeting where various tribes came to trade goods with settlers and each other. It was there, among the crowds of people, the displays of furs and beads, dried meat, and woven baskets, that he first saw her. She was standing near a collection of beautifully crafted pottery, speaking with an older woman. She wore a dress made of soft deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork, and her long black hair hung in two braids down her back. When she laughed at something the older woman said, the sound carried across the gathering like wind chimes. James had stared, unable to look away. One of his companions, a grizzled trader named Murphy, noticed his interest and chuckled. "That's one of Chief Running Bear's daughters," Murphy had said. "Little Sparrow, they call her. Pretty as a picture, but don't get any ideas, boy. Her father would have your scalp if you so much as spoke to her wrong." But James had not been able to help himself. Over the course of that 3-day gathering, he found excuses to walk past where she was working, to be near enough to hear her voice. On the second day, their eyes met across the crowd, and she smiled at him. It was a small smile, quick, and perhaps a bit shy, but it had struck James like lightning. On the third day, he gathered his courage and approached her, stumbling over his words as he tried to compliment the pottery she was selling. Little Sparrow had listened to his awkward attempt at conversation with amusement dancing in her dark eyes. To his surprise, she spoke English quite well, having learned from missionaries who had passed through their territory. They talked for nearly an hour that day, until her mother called her away. But before she left, she told him that her people sometimes camped near the river about 5 miles south of where the surveying company had set up their base. James knew it was foolish, knew he was risking trouble, but he could not stay away. A week after the gathering, he rode out to the river on his one day off. He found Little Sparrow there, almost as if she had been waiting for him, though she pretended to be surprised to see him. They sat on the riverbank and talked for hours, about her life, about the changing seasons and following the buffalo herds, about the stories her grandmother told around the fire. James told her about cities she could barely imagine, about buildings taller than trees and streets filled with more people than she had ever seen in one place. That summer, they met as often as they could. Little Sparrow taught James things no surveying manual could teach him. She showed him how to read tracks in the dirt, how to tell which plants were safe to eat and which would make you sick, how to move quietly through the forest without disturbing the animals. She taught him that the land was not something to be conquered or measured, but something to be understood and respected. James, in turn, shared his knowledge with her, teaching her to read and write English better, showing her maps and explaining how his people viewed and recorded the world. But it was more than just an exchange of knowledge. James fell deeply in love with her quick mind and ready laughter, with the way she saw beauty in things he had never noticed before, with the gentleness in her hands when she bandaged a cut on his arm after he fell climbing rocks, and he hoped that she felt the same way about him. The second summer was even better than the first. By then, James had become more skilled at his work and had earned some respect from his fellow surveyors. He requested assignments that kept him near the river area, giving him more opportunities to see Little Sparrow, They talked about a future together, though both knew how difficult it would be. James's family would never accept a native wife, and Little Sparrow's father had very different plans for his daughter. The trouble started in late August of 1855. The surveying company's work had expanded into territory that the Crow people considered sacred. James had tried to explain to his superiors that they were causing offense, that they needed to negotiate properly with the tribe, but his concerns were dismissed. Tensions began to rise. There were angry confrontations between tribal members and surveyors. Little Sparrow's father, Chief Running Bear, became increasingly hostile toward any white presence near his people. Then came the day that changed everything. James and Little Sparrow had been meeting by their usual spot near the river when her older brother discovered them. There was a violent confrontation. Her brother did not hurt James physically, but he dragged Little Sparrow back to their camp and told their father everything. Chief Running Bear was furious. He forbade Little Sparrow from ever seeing James again and posted warriors to make sure she obeyed. James tried to speak with the chief, tried to ask for permission to court Little Sparrow properly, but he was turned away with threats of violence if he came near the camp again. The surveying company, fearing an armed conflict, ordered James to leave the area immediately. They reassigned him to a different territory hundreds of miles away. He had no choice but to obey or lose his job, and without work he would have no way to survive in the West. The last time James saw Little Sparrow, it was from a distance. He had ridden to a hill overlooking the Crow Camp one final time before leaving Montana. He saw her standing outside one of the lodges, and even from far away he could see that she was crying. He wanted to ride down there, to take her away with him, but he knew that would only lead to bloodshed, so he turned his horse around and rode away, carrying with him a broken heart and memories that would last a lifetime. James had returned east, defeated and heartbroken. His family welcomed him back, relieved that his western adventure was over. They never knew about Little Sparrow, never knew that their son spent months barely eating or sleeping, consumed by grief for a love he had lost. Eventually time did what time does. The sharp pain dulled to a constant ache. James threw himself into work, though he never did become a lawyer. Instead, he worked in his uncle's merchant business. 3 years after leaving Montana, he met Sarah at a church social. She was a quiet woman, sensible and kind, the daughter of a shopkeeper. She was nothing like Little Sparrow, and perhaps that was why James allowed himself to court her. They married in 1858, and it was a good marriage, if not a passionate one. Sarah was patient with James's occasional dark moods, with the way he would sometimes stare off into the distance as if seeing something far away. She gave him stability and companionship, and over time he grew to love her in his own way. When the opportunity came to return west in 1870, to buy a ranch in Montana with money he had inherited from his uncle, Sarah had agreed to go even though she was frightened of frontier life. They had built the ranch together, worked side by side through hard years and good ones. Sarah had never been able to have children, which saddened her greatly, but she poured her love into their home and into James. When she died 3 years ago, James had grieved deeply and honestly. She had been a good wife and he had loved her, but he had never forgotten Little Sparrow. Even during his years with Sarah, there had been nights when he dreamed of the girl by the river, of her laughter and the way the sunlight caught in her black hair. He had assumed she had married someone from her tribe, had children, lived a full life. He had hoped she was happy. Never in all his imaginings had he thought he would see her again. Now here she was, sleeping in his arms as he rode toward his ranch house. No longer the young girl he had loved, but a woman who had lived a full lifetime, just as he had. A woman someone had tried to kill. The questions burned in his mind. What had happened to her over these 30 years? Why had someone tied her to that rock and left her to die? And why, of all the impossible coincidences, had she been left at that particular spot, so close to where they used to meet all those years ago? As Copper walked into the ranch yard, Little Sparrow stirred against his chest. Her eyes opened slowly, confused for a moment before memory returned. She looked up at James, then at the simple wooden house and barn before them. "You live here?" she asked, her voice still hoarse. "Yes," James replied. "For 16 years now. It's not much, but it's home. And right now, it's safe." He dismounted carefully, then helped Little Sparrow down. Her legs were still unsteady, and she had to lean heavily on him as they walked toward the house. James pushed open the door and guided her inside to the small bedroom that had once been his and Sarah's. He had not slept in this room since Sarah died, preferring instead to sleep in the small side room that they had once planned to use as a nursery. "You should rest," James said, helping her sit on the edge of the bed. "I'll heat some water so you can wash, and I'll make some soup. You need to eat something, but your stomach probably can't handle anything too heavy right now." Little Sparrow nodded, her eyes traveling around the simple room, taking in the wooden furniture, the faded curtains, the small mirror on the wall. "James," she said softly, "I never thought I would see you again." "I know," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I never thought I'd see you either. But you're here now and you're safe. That's what matters. We can talk about everything else after you've rested and recovered." He left her then, closing the door gently behind him, and walked to the kitchen on legs that felt like they might give out at any moment. James leaned against the kitchen table, his hands gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. 33 years had passed since he last held Little Sparrow. 33 years of living separate lives, of losses and gains, of becoming different people than the young lovers they had been. And now she was back, brought to him by circumstances he did not yet understand, lying in his bed while he tried to make sense of a world that had suddenly turned upside down. James took a deep breath, then another. There would be time for questions and answers. There would be time to understand what had happened and why. For now, he needed to take care of her, to help her heal from whatever terrible thing had led to her being tied to that rock. He filled a pot with water and set it on the stove to heat, then began gathering ingredients for a simple broth. As he worked, his hands steady despite the turmoil in his heart, James wondered what tomorrow would bring, and whether the past could ever truly be left behind. For 3 days, Little Sparrow rested in the bedroom while James tended to her needs with quiet efficiency. He brought her warm broth, changed the bandages on her rope-burned wrists, and sat by her bedside when nightmares woke her in the darkness. During those first days, they spoke little, both of them seeming to understand that certain conversations required strength that Little Sparrow did not yet possess. James could see the exhaustion in her eyes, a weariness that went far deeper than physical fatigue. Whatever had happened to her had left wounds that could not be seen, but were no less real than the marks on her wrists. On the 4th morning, James woke to find Little Sparrow sitting at his kitchen table. She had washed and braided her hair, and though she still looked thin and tired, there was a determined set to her shoulders that had not been there before. She wore one of Sarah's old dresses that James had given her, and the sight of it created a strange ache in his chest, seeing this woman from his past wearing clothes that had belonged to his late wife. "You should still be resting," James said, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot that sat warming on the stove. "I have rested enough," Little Sparrow replied. Her voice was stronger now, no longer the hoarse whisper it had been when he found her. "And you have questions. I can see them in your eyes every time you look at me. It is time I gave you answers." James sat down across from her at the table, the same table where he and Sarah had shared countless meals over the years. The morning light came through the window, falling across Little Sparrow's face and highlighting the lines that time had carved there. He waited, not pushing, letting her find her own way to begin the story. "After you left," she started, her eyes focused on her hands folded on the table, "my father was very angry. He felt I had dishonored our family by meeting with you in secret. For many months he watched me closely, made sure I could not leave the camp without escorts. I was heartbroken, James. I thought about you every day, wondered where you had gone, if you thought of me." James felt his throat tighten but said nothing, letting her continue. 2 winters after you left, my father arranged a marriage for me. The man's name was Black Eagle. He was a respected warrior, strong and brave, 10 years older than me. I did not love him, but I had no choice in the matter. That was not our way. Daughters obeyed their fathers, and fathers made decisions they believed were best for the tribe and for alliances between families. She paused, reaching for the cup of water James had placed before her, taking a small sip before continuing. "I married Black Eagle in the spring of 1857. I tried to be a good wife to him. He was not cruel to me. He provided well, was respected among our people, and in time, I gave him 3 children. 2 sons and a daughter." The mention of children struck James like a physical blow. Of course she would have had children. She had lived an entire life, a full life, while he had been living his own hundreds of miles away. It was foolish to feel this surge of something like jealousy, but he could not help it. "My oldest son, Running Deer, is 30 years old now. He has his own family. My second son, Swiftwater, is 28. And my daughter, Morning Rain, she is 25. Little Sparrow's voice softened when she spoke of her children, and a small smile touched her lips. "They are good people, James. Strong and kind. They gave me grandchildren. I thought that was my life's purpose, to raise them and to support my husband." "What happened to Black Eagle?" James asked gently. The smile faded from Little Sparrow's face. 5 years ago there was trouble with the cavalry. There had been many troubles over the years, you understand. Our hunting grounds kept shrinking. Treaties were signed and then broken. We were pushed onto smaller and smaller pieces of land. Black Eagle was one of the warriors who refused to accept this quietly. He believed we should fight to protect what was ours. One day, there was a confrontation near the reservation boundary. The cavalry claimed our men had crossed into territory they no longer had rights to. Black Eagle and 3 other warriors were shot. He died that evening, in our lodge, with me holding his hand. James reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. I am sorry for your loss. Little Sparrow looked at their joined hands for a long moment before continuing. After Black Eagle died, my life changed. In our tribe, widows are respected, but also expected to rely on their sons or brothers for protection and guidance. My sons were good to me, but I had spent 30 years as a wife and mother, and I found I had opinions about things, about the direction our tribe was taking. I began to speak at council gatherings, something I had never done before. She pulled her hand away gently and stood, walking to the window to look out at the prairie beyond. James remained seated, watching her, seeing the tension in her shoulders as she prepared to tell him the hardest part of her story. About a year ago, men came to our reservation. White men in fine suits, not soldiers or traders. They said they represented a railway company. They wanted to buy land from our tribe, land that included sacred sites where our ancestors are buried, where we have held ceremonies for generations. They offered money, more money than most of our people had ever seen. But it was not a fair price, and more importantly, the land they wanted was not just land. It was part of our history, our identity. James felt a cold dread beginning to form in his stomach. He knew about the railway companies and their aggressive expansion across the West. He had heard stories of the tactics they used to acquire land, some legal and many not. Some of the tribal leaders were tempted by the money, Little Sparrow continued. Our people are poor, James. The government supplies we are promised often do not arrive, or arrive spoiled and useless. Children go hungry. The elders need medicine we cannot afford, so when these men in fine suits offered gold, some leaders listened. But others, including me, spoke against it. We said that selling this particular land would be a betrayal of everything our people stood for, that no amount of money could replace what would be lost. She turned from the window to face James, and he could see tears glistening in her eyes. The railwaymen did not like opposition. They began to use other methods. They found tribal members who were desperate or angry or greedy, and they bribed them. They created division within our community. Brother turned against brother. Families were split apart over this issue. And they made threats, quiet threats that could not be proven but were understood by everyone. What kind of threats? James asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. They said that those who opposed the sale might have accidents. They said that tribal members who stood in the way of progress would find their rations cut off, their children denied access to the reservation school. They were careful, these railwaymen. They never made direct threats that could be reported to the authorities. Everything was done through intermediaries, through tribal members they had corrupted with money or whiskey. Little Sparrow returned to the table and sat down heavily, as if the weight of her story was pressing down on her. My nephew, my younger brother's son, his name is Broken Arrow. He is 22 years old, and he has been angry all his life. Angry at the cavalry for killing his uncle, angry at the government for the poverty on the reservation, angry at the tribal elders for what he sees as weakness and surrender. The railwaymen found him and filled his head with ideas. They told him that the old ways were dead, that people like me who wanted to preserve sacred sites were holding the tribe back from prosperity. Your own nephew did this to you? James could hardly believe what he was hearing, though. He knew that desperation and manipulation could turn even family members against each other. Broken Arrow gathered others like himself, young men who felt displaced and powerless, who wanted to lash out at something. The railwaymen gave them money and whiskey and convinced them that I was the main obstacle to the land sale. They said that if I would be silenced, the deal could go through and everyone would benefit. Little Sparrow's voice shook slightly as she spoke. 3 weeks ago, I spoke at a large tribal council meeting. I presented evidence that the railway company had forged some of the signatures on the preliminary agreements. I showed that they had bribed certain individuals and that the sale was not supported by the majority of our people as they claimed. She took a shaky breath before continuing. 2 nights after that meeting, Broken Arrow and 4 others came to my lodge. My sons were away hunting. I was alone with my daughter. They dragged me outside, tied my hands, and put a sack over my head so I could not see where they were taking me. The morning rain tried to stop them, but they pushed her down. They told her that if she spoke of what happened, they would come back for her and her children. James felt rage building inside him, hot and fierce. To think of Little Sparrow being treated this way, terrorized by her own people, by her own family member, Made him want to ride out immediately and find this broken arrow and make him pay for what he had done. They took me far from the reservation to that place where you found me. Do you know why they chose that spot, James?" Little Sparrow looked directly at him now, her dark eyes holding his. "They chose it because it was near where you and I used to meet by the river all those years ago. Broken Arrow's father, my brother, he knew about us. He was one of the people who helped our father keep me away from you. Broken Arrow said that I had always been a traitor to our people, that even as a girl I had betrayed them by meeting with a white man. He said I deserved to die in the place where my betrayal began." The cruelty of it took James's breath away. To be left to die in a place that had once held such happiness, such innocent love, was a viciousness that went beyond simple violence. They tied me to that rock and told me that the animals would find me, or the cold would take me, or I would simply die of thirst. They said my body would be a warning to anyone else who tried to stand in the way of progress. And they left me there. Little Sparrow's voice had become very quiet. I spent that whole day and night tied to that stone. I called for help until my voice gave out. I prayed to the spirits of my ancestors. I thought about my children and grandchildren. I thought about Black Eagle. And James, I will tell you the truth, I thought about you too. I thought about those summers by the river, about how young and happy we were, about how simple life seemed back then. She reached across the table and took both of James's hands in hers. And then you found me. Of all the people in all the world who could have found me, it was you. After 33 years, after everything that has happened, after all the paths our lives have taken, somehow you were the one who heard me crying out. How do you explain such a thing?" James shook his head slowly. He had no explanation. Coincidence seemed too small a word for it. Fate seemed too grand. All he knew was that some force he did not understand, had led him to that rocky outcrop at exactly the right moment. The cattle had wandered, he said simply. If they had not strayed toward that area, I would not have been there. If I had ridden out an hour earlier or later, I might have missed you. I do not know if it was chance or something more. Little Sparrow. I only know that I am grateful beyond words that I found you. They sat in silence for a long moment, hands clasped across the table, two people who had been torn apart by circumstance decades ago and brought back together by forces neither fully understood. Finally, James spoke again. What about your children? Do they know you are alive? They must be worried sick about you. Little Sparrow nodded. I need to send word to them. Morning Rain will be frightened. But James, there is more you need to know. The railway company, the land they want to buy, it is not just on the reservation. They want to build a line that cuts through this area. Your ranch, it sits on land they want to acquire. James felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. My ranch? Yes. I heard them talking about it before, about the ranchers in this area who were refusing to sell. They mentioned a stubborn old cowboy who would not listen to reason, who kept turning down their offers. I did not know then that they were talking about you. But now I understand. They want my tribal land and your ranch, James. We are both obstacles to the same people. They tried to kill me, to remove my opposition. What do you think they will do to you? The weight of Little Sparrow's words hung in the air between them like a dark cloud. James sat back in his chair, his mind racing as he processed this new information. He had received several visits over the past 6 months from men in expensive suits, representatives of the Montana Pacific Railway Company. Each time they had offered him money for his land, and each time he had refused. The offers had grown increasingly generous, but James had no interest in selling. This ranch was all he had left, the life he and Sarah had built together. Without it, he would be nothing, just another old man with nowhere to go and nothing to do. They have been pressuring me, James admitted, running a hand through his graying hair. The last time they came, about 3 weeks ago, their tone was different, less friendly. The man doing the talking, fellow named Hutchins. He said it would be unfortunate if accidents started happening on my property. Said ranching was dangerous work, that a man my age could get hurt real easy if he was not careful. Little Sparrow's expression darkened. These are the same kind of threats they made to our people. They do not make direct statements that could be reported to the law. They simply suggest possibilities. Let your imagination fill in the rest. It is effective because it creates fear without giving you anything concrete to take to the authorities. I am not afraid of them, James said. Though even as he spoke the words, he knew they were only partly true. He was not afraid for himself, perhaps, but the thought of what these men might be capable of, what they had already done to Little Sparrow, made him uneasy. You should be afraid, Little Sparrow said firmly. These men have power and money and no conscience. They have already tried to kill me. They will not hesitate to hurt you if you continue to stand in their way. James stood and walked to the stove, pouring himself another cup of coffee he did not really want. just needing something to do with his hands. So what do we do? I cannot just give up my ranch. This land is all I have. And you cannot let them destroy your people's sacred sites. There has to be another way. Perhaps there is, Little Sparrow said slowly. You said they have been making you offers? Putting things in writing? Yes. I have kept all their letters and documents. Sarah always told me to keep records of everything important. After she died, I kept up the habit. James gestured toward a small desk in the corner of the room. Everything is in there. Every letter, every offer they have made. And I know things, Little Sparrow continued, her voice growing stronger, more determined. I heard conversations I was not supposed to hear. I know which tribal members were bribed and how much they were paid. I know about the forged signatures on the preliminary agreements. If we could combine what you have with what I know, perhaps we could build a case against them, prove that they are operating dishonestly. James turned to look at her, seeing the fire in her eyes, the same determination he remembered from all those years ago, when she had insisted she could teach him to track deer even though he had never done it before. That would be dangerous. If they are willing to leave you tied to a rock to die, what would they do if they found out we were gathering evidence against them? They already want both of us gone, Little Sparrow pointed out. We are in danger whether we fight back or not. At least if we fight, we have a chance of stopping them. James considered this, weighing the risks against the alternatives. If they did nothing, the railway company would eventually find a way to get what they wanted. They would wear him down or force him out, and they would push through their land purchase on the reservation through intimidation and corruption. But if they fought back, if they could expose the company's illegal tactics, perhaps they could stop this while protecting both his ranch and the tribal lands. We would need help, James said finally. We could not do this alone. We would need someone in authority who is honest and willing to listen. There is a federal Indian agent, a man named Thomas Cooper. He came to our reservation 6 months ago, replacing the previous agent who everyone knew was corrupt. Cooper seems different. He has been asking questions, looking into irregularities in how supplies are distributed and how decisions are made. Some of our people think he might actually care about doing his job properly. And there is the territorial marshal in Great Falls, a man named Brennan. I met him once, a few years back when there was trouble with cattle rustlers. He struck me as an honest man. Someone who believed in the law. James felt hope beginning to stir in his chest, fragile but real. If we could get evidence to both of them, if we could prove what the railway company has been doing, they would have to investigate. Little Sparrow nodded. But first, I need to get word to my children that I am alive and safe, and we need to gather all the evidence we can before the railway company realizes I survived and that we are working together. Over the next week, James and Little Sparrow worked in careful coordination. James sent a trusted neighbor, an older Mexican rancher named Miguel Reyes, who had no love for railway companies himself, to deliver a message to Little Sparrow's children on the reservation. The message was brief and careful, saying only that their mother was safe and recovering from an illness at a friend's ranch, and that she would contact them again soon with more details. Meanwhile, James retrieved all the documents he had stored away, laying them out on his kitchen table. There were letters from the railway company, each offered progressively more generous and more insistent. There were newspaper clippings about the proposed railway line and its route. There were surveys of his land that he had never authorized, suggesting the company had sent people onto his property without permission. Little Sparrow, for her part, wrote down everything she could remember. She listed names of tribal members who had been bribed and the amounts they had received. She described the forged signatures she had discovered on the preliminary land sale agreements. She detailed the threats that had been made, both veiled and direct, against people who opposed the sale. Her memory was sharp, and her written English, though she occasionally asked James for help with spelling, was clear and detailed. This is good, James said, reviewing her pages of notes. But we need more. We need something that directly connects the railway company to the violence against you, to the bribes, to all of it. Right now we have your testimony and some circumstantial evidence, but a good lawyer could argue that you are a disgruntled tribal member making accusations without proof. Little Sparrow frowned, thinking hard. Broken Arrow and the others who took me, they were not smart about it. They talked freely in front of me because they thought I would be dead. They mentioned meeting with a man named Hutchins several times. Is that the same Hutchins who visited you? Yes, Gerald Hutchins. He is the head representative for Montana Pacific Railway in this region. James felt his pulse quicken. What did they say about him? They said Hutchins had given them money and promised more after I was taken care of. They said he had told them exactly where to leave me, at that place by the river. Broken Arrow laughed about it, said Hutchins had really done his research to find that particular spot. Little Sparrow's face hardened at the memory. If we could prove Hutchins paid them, if we could connect him directly to what they did to me, That would be evidence of a serious crime. The problem is getting that proof, James said. Your nephew and his friends are not going to confess, and I doubt Hutchins was foolish enough to pay them with bank drafts that could be traced. They sat in frustrated silence for a moment, and then Little Sparrow spoke. There might be a way. My nephew is proud and foolish. He brags about things he should keep quiet, and he drinks too much, especially when someone else is paying. If someone were to approach him in the right way, ask the right questions while buying him drinks, he might say more than he should. That is too dangerous, James said immediately. If anyone connected to us approaches him, he will become suspicious. Not if it's done carefully, not if the person doing it seems to have nothing to do with either of us. Little Sparrow leaned forward, her eyes intense. There is a trading post on the edge of the reservation where many of the young men gather. The owner is a white man named Peterson who sells whiskey illegally and does not ask too many questions about where people get their money. If someone were to go there, someone Broken Arrow does not know, and strike up conversations over drinks, they might learn something useful. James shook his head. I cannot do it. Broken Arrow knows me, or at least he would recognize me as the white rancher from this area, and you certainly cannot do it. No, but Miguel could, Little Sparrow said. Your neighbor, the one who delivered my message. He is Mexican, not white. He would not seem connected to the railway dispute. And you said he has no love for railway companies. Would he help us? James considered this. Miguel Reyes was a good man, someone James had known for years. His own ranch had been threatened by railway expansion in Texas before he moved to Montana. He had lost a brother in a dispute with a railroad company over land rights. Yes, Miguel might be willing to help, especially if James explained the full situation. I will talk to him, James said. But even if he agrees, even if we get more evidence, we still face another problem. The moment we start making official accusations, the railway company will know you are alive. They will know we are working together. They will come after both of us with everything they have. Then we need to be smart about it, Little Sparrow replied. We need to gather all our evidence first, make sure it is complete and convincing. Then we need to present it to both the federal Indian agent and the territorial marshal at the same time so the railway company cannot suppress it or intimidate just one official. We need to move quickly and decisively, give them no time to react before the authorities are involved. As they talked through their plan, James found himself marveling at the woman sitting across from him. This was not the girl he had known 33 years ago, the young woman who had laughed by the river and taught him about the natural world. This was someone who had been shaped by decades of hardship and loss, who had raised children and lost a husband, who had survived an attempt on her life and emerged determined to fight back. She was stronger than he had imagined, more resilient and more courageous, and as he looked at her, James felt something stirring in his chest that he had not felt in years. It was not the wild passion of youth, not the overwhelming infatuation he had experienced as a 20-year-old boy meeting a beautiful girl for the first time. This was something different, something deeper. It was respect and admiration, certainly, but it was also a recognition of shared purpose and understanding. They were two people who had lived full lives separately, who had loved and lost and endured, and who now found themselves fighting the same battle. What are you thinking? Little Sparrow asked, noticing the way he was looking at her. James smiled, a real smile that felt strange on his face after so many years of grief and loneliness. I'm thinking that life is full of surprises. 3 weeks ago, I was alone on this ranch, going through each day without much purpose beyond basic survival. Now here you are, and suddenly I have something to fight for again, something that matters. Little Sparrow reached across the table and took his hand, the gesture simple and warm. I am glad it was you who found me, James. I am glad that after all these years, we have this chance to help each other. So am I, James said quietly. The next morning, James rode over to Miguel Reyes's ranch to discuss their plan. Miguel listened carefully to everything James told him, his weathered face growing more serious as the story unfolded. When James finished, Miguel was quiet for a long moment. This is dangerous business, amigo, Miguel said finally. These railway people, they do not play fair. They have money and lawyers and politicians in their pockets. Taking them on is not something to do lightly. I know, James acknowledged, and I would not ask you to risk yourself if there was another way. But Little Sparrow and I, we cannot do this alone. We need help from someone we can trust. Miguel studied James's face, seeing something there that made him nod slowly. You care for this woman. I can see it in your eyes when you speak of her. She's not just someone you are helping. She means something to you. James did not deny it. She was my first love, Miguel, a lifetime ago, before I married Sarah, before I came to this ranch. I thought I would never see her again, and then fate or chance, or God brought her back into my life. I cannot let anything happen to her, and I cannot let these railway men destroy what she is fighting to protect any more than I can let them take my ranch." Miguel smiled, clapping James on the shoulder. "Then I will help you, my friend. Love makes fools of us all, but it also makes us brave. I will go to this trading post and see what I can learn from this nephew of hers. But you must promise me something. Anything. Promise me that when this is over, you will not waste whatever time you have left. You and this woman, you have been given a second chance. Do not throw it away." Miguel Reyes proved to be as good as his word. Over the next 10 days, he made several visits to Peterson's trading post on the edge of the Crow Reservation. He went at different times, sometimes in the afternoon and sometimes in the evening, always careful not to appear too interested in any particular person or conversation. He bought supplies, traded stories with other visitors, and slowly became a familiar face at the establishment. Peterson, the owner, was a greedy man who cared only about profit and asked no questions as long as customers had money to spend. On Miguel's 4th visit, he finally encountered Broken Arrow. The young man came in with 2 companions, all of them already showing signs of having been drinking elsewhere. They were loud and boastful, talking about how things were going to change soon, how people who had looked down on them would soon see their value. Miguel bought them a round of drinks, playing the part of a friendly stranger who enjoyed company and conversation. "You boys seem confident about something," Miguel said casually, raising his glass. "Good things coming your way?" Broken Arrow, his judgment already clouded by alcohol, puffed up with pride. "We did important work recently. Work that is going to benefit the whole tribe, even if some people are too stupid to see it. Important work deserves important pay," Miguel said, signaling Peterson to bring another round. "A man should be rewarded properly for his efforts." "Oh, we were paid," one of Broken Arrow's companions said, before Broken Arrow shot him a warning look. But the damage was done, and with more drinks flowing, the story began to emerge in pieces. They spoke carefully at first, but Miguel was patient and knew how to ask questions that did not seem like questions. He expressed sympathy for their position, agreed that sometimes difficult decisions had to be made for the greater good, and kept the whiskey coming. By the end of the evening, Miguel had learned that Broken Arrow and his group had been paid $200 by a man they met in Great Falls, money provided specifically to remove an obstacle to the railway deal. They had been told exactly where to take Little Sparrow and had been promised another $300 once the land sale went through. Broken Arrow, drunk and proud, even mentioned Hutchins by name, describing him as a man who understood that progress sometimes required harsh measures. Miguel reported all of this back to James and Little Sparrow 2 days later. They sat at James's kitchen table, the afternoon sun streaming through the windows, as Miguel recounted every detail he could remember. "He actually admitted that Hutchins paid them?" James asked, hardly believing their luck. "Not directly to Hutchins, but to a man Hutchins sent. The payment was made in Great Falls at a hotel called the Northern Star. Broken Arrow described the man who paid them, said he had a scar on his left hand and wore expensive boots. He also said there were papers involved, that they had to sign something, though he claimed he did not read it carefully." Little Sparrow's eyes widened. "Papers? If they signed something, there might be a record of the transaction. That would be direct evidence connecting the railway company to what they did to me." "We need to get to Great Falls," James said, his mind already working through the logistics. "We need to find this man with the scar, see if we can trace the payment back to Hutchins and the railway company. And we need to do it quickly, before Broken Arrow sobers up enough to realize he talked too much." The journey to Great Falls took 2 days. James and Little Sparrow traveled together, with Little Sparrow wearing a bonnet that partially obscured her face and clothing borrowed from Sarah's old wardrobe. They could not risk anyone recognizing her, especially if the railway company had people watching for her. They told anyone who asked that they were a married couple going to the city for supplies and business. During those 2 days of travel, James and Little Sparrow talked more than they had in all the time since he found her. They spoke about their lives over the past 33 years, filling in the gaps and sharing stories. Little Sparrow told him about raising her children, about the joys and struggles of life on the reservation, about the slow erosion of traditional ways as the world changed around them. James told her about his years with Sarah, about building the ranch, about the loneliness that had consumed him after his wife's death. "Did you love her?" Little Sparrow asked one evening as they camped beside a stream. "Your wife, Sarah? Did you truly love her?" James considered the question carefully, wanting to be honest. "Yes, I loved her. Not the way I loved you, perhaps. With you, it was fire and passion and the feeling that nothing else in the world mattered. With Sarah, it was gentler, more like a warm hearth on a cold night. She was my partner and my friend. She made my life better by being in it. I mourned her deeply when she passed. Little Sparrow nodded, accepting this. I understand. I cared for Black Eagle too, though it was not the love of my youth. He was a good husband and father. He deserved better than the death he received. But I will confess something to you, James. Even after all those years of marriage, even with children and grandchildren, there were still nights when I would think of you and wonder what might have been. I thought of you too, James admitted, more often than I probably should have. Sarah never knew about you. I felt it would be unfair to her to speak of a love I had lost before we met. But you were always there, in the back of my mind, a road not taken. They reached Great Falls on the afternoon of the second day. It was a growing city, rough around the edges, but expanding rapidly as Montana territory developed. They found rooms at a modest boarding house run by a widow who asked no questions as long as payment was made in advance. That evening, they began their investigation at the Northern Star Hotel. The Northern Star was a nicer establishment than most in Great Falls, the kind of place where business was conducted and deals were made. The lobby was decorated with heavy furniture and paintings of mountain landscapes. Behind the desk stood a thin man with spectacles who looked up as James approached. "Good evening," James said, adopting his most friendly tone. "I am looking for information about a business associate of mine. He would have stayed here about 3 weeks ago, a man with a distinctive scar on his left hand. Would you remember anyone like that?" The desk clerk's expression became guarded. "We have many guests, sir. I could not possibly remember every distinguishing feature of every person who stays with us." James reached into his pocket and placed a $5 gold piece on the counter. "Perhaps this might help refresh your memory." The clerk looked at the coin, then at James, considering. Finally, he reached out and swept the coin into his palm. "There was a gentleman matching that description, Mr. Frank Sutton. He stayed here for 3 nights, checked out about 2.5 weeks ago. He met with several people during his stay. I remember him because he tipped well and because he spent money freely in our restaurant." "Did he meet with any native men while he was here?" James asked. The clerk hesitated, and James produced another gold piece. The man sighed and took it. "Yes, on his second night here. 3 or 4 young men, native fellows. They met in one of our private dining rooms. There was drinking involved, and some kind of business was conducted. I did not see exactly what, you understand, but papers were exchanged and money changed hands. Do you know if Mr. Sutton is connected to any particular company or business?" "He mentioned working for Montana Pacific Railway. Said he was handling land acquisitions for them." The clerk leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Between you and me, sir, Mr. Sutton is not someone I would want to do business with. There was something cold about him, something that made me uneasy. The type of man who would do whatever needed doing without losing sleep over it." James thanked the clerk and returned to Little Sparrow, who had been waiting in the boarding house. He shared what he had learned, and they both felt the weight of this new information. They now had direct testimony linking a railway company employee to a payment made to Broken Arrow and his companions just before Little Sparrow was attacked. The next morning they sought out Thomas Cooper, the federal Indian agent. His office was in a government building near the center of town, a plain room with maps of reservation territories covering the walls. Cooper himself was a man in his early 40s, with a stern face but kind eyes. He listened carefully as Little Sparrow, with James sitting beside her for support, told her entire story. She held nothing back. She described the railway company's attempts to acquire sacred tribal land, the bribes and corruption, the threats made against those who opposed the sale. She told him about being kidnapped by her own nephew and left to die, and about the evidence they had gathered linking these actions to the railway company. When she finished, Cooper sat back in his chair, his expression grave. "This is serious," he said finally. "If what you are telling me is true, and I have no reason to doubt you, then Montana Pacific Railway has committed multiple federal crimes. Bribery of tribal members, attempted murder, conspiracy to defraud the government, and land dealings. But I need to be honest with you. The railway companies have powerful friends. Taking them on will not be easy, and there will be people who try to stop any investigation before it begins. That is why we are also taking this information to the territorial marshal," James explained. "We want multiple authorities involved, so the railway company cannot silence the investigation through pressure on any one person." Cooper nodded approvingly. "Smart thinking. Marshal Brennan is a good man. Between the two of us, we should be able to launch a proper investigation. But I warn you both, you are in danger until this is resolved. These people have already tried to kill you once, Mrs. P. I apologize, I do not know your married name." "I am called Little Sparrow," she said simply, "and I know the danger, but I will not hide while my people's land is stolen through lies and violence." Their meeting with Marshal Brennan that afternoon went similarly well. Brennan was a tall man with a gray mustache and the weathered look of someone who had spent years enforcing law in difficult territory. He examined all the documents they had brought, listened to their testimonies, and asked detailed questions. When they mentioned Frank Sutton and the payment at the Northern Star Hotel, his eyes sharpened with interest. "Sutton is known to us," Brennan said. "He has been connected to several questionable incidents over the years, but nothing we could ever prove conclusively. If we can tie him directly to an attempted murder, that changes everything. With your permission, I would like to bring him in for questioning." "What about Hutchins and the railway company?" James asked. "Sutton is just an employee. The real guilt lies with those who gave the orders." "One step at a time," Brennan replied. "First we get Sutton, then we make him talk. Men like him usually save their own skin when faced with serious charges. If he confesses and implicates his employers, we can build a case against the railway company itself. It will take time, but if the evidence is as strong as you say, justice will be served." Over the next 2 weeks, events moved quickly. Sutton was arrested and, faced with charges of conspiracy to commit murder, did exactly what Brennan predicted. He confessed to paying Broken Arrow and his companions to eliminate Little Sparrow as an obstacle to the railway's plans. He provided written statements implicating Hutchins and other railway company officials in a broader pattern of intimidation and corruption. Broken Arrow and his companions were also arrested. When confronted with evidence of their crime and informed that they had been betrayed by the very people who paid them, Broken Arrow broke down and confirmed everything. He was young and foolish enough to believe that a few $100s justified what he had done, but not hardened enough to face the reality of hanging for murder. The scandal that erupted shook Montana territory. Newspapers carried stories about the railway company's illegal tactics. Federal investigators arrived to examine the railway's land dealings across the region. Several company officials, including Hutchins, were arrested and charged with multiple crimes. The proposed land purchase on the Crow Reservation was canceled, and an investigation was launched into all previous land transactions to determine which had been obtained through fraud. Through all of this, James and Little Sparrow stood together. They testified at hearings, provided evidence to investigators, and faced down threats from those who still supported the railway company's interests. It was exhausting and often frightening work, but they did it side by side, drawing strength from each other. As the legal proceedings continued, something else began to develop between them. The connection they had felt as young lovers decades ago had transformed into something richer and more complex. They would sit on James's porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the prairie, and talk about everything and nothing. They laughed together, shared comfortable silences, and slowly realized that what they felt for each other now was deeper than what they had experienced in their youth. One evening, about 2 months after the arrests, James took Little Sparrow's hand as they sat watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "I have been thinking," he said quietly, "about the future. About what comes next after all of this legal business is finished." "I have been thinking about that too," Little Sparrow replied. "My children want me to return to the reservation, to live with one of them. They worry about me being here." James felt his heart sink, but he nodded. "That would be natural. They love you and want you close, but I am not sure that is what I want," Little Sparrow continued. "James, we were given a second chance, something few people ever receive. We found each other again after all these years. I do not want to waste whatever time we have left living separately, wondering what might have been for the second time in our lives." James turned to look at her, hope rising in his chest. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I would like to stay here, if you will have me. Not as a guest or someone you are helping, but as your partner, your wife, if you would want that." She smiled a bit uncertainly. "I know people will talk. A white rancher and a native widow? It will cause scandal in both our communities. But I am too old to care much about scandal anymore." James felt tears prick at his eyes, something that rarely happened to him. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Little Sparrow, nothing would make me happier. I loved you when we were young, and I find that I love you now, perhaps even more deeply because we have both lived enough to understand how precious and rare this is." They were married a month later in a quiet ceremony at James's ranch. Thomas Cooper, the federal Indian agent, stood as witness, along with Miguel Reyes and his wife. Little Sparrow's 3 children came, hesitant at first, but gradually warming to James as they saw how happy their mother was. Some of the townspeople were scandalized, as Little Sparrow had predicted, but others, particularly those who had benefited from the exposure of the railway company's corruption, were supportive. The ranch became something new under their joint stewardship. Little Sparrow brought knowledge of the land that James had never possessed, teaching him better ways to work with nature rather than against it. James, in turn, shared what he knew about cattle ranching and managing a business. They began hosting gatherings where people from the town and the reservation could meet in neutral territory, building bridges between communities that had too often been divided. Little Sparrow's grandchildren visited often, and the ranch that had been so silent and lonely after Sarah's death filled with the sounds of children's laughter. James discovered that there was joy in teaching these young ones about the land, about caring for animals, about respecting the earth that sustained them all. On quiet evenings, James and Little Sparrow would sit on their porch, his arm around her shoulders, and watch the sun paint the sky with colors that seemed more vibrant now than they had in years. They would talk about the day's work, make plans for the future, and sometimes just sit in companionable silence, two souls who had traveled long and difficult roads, only to find their way back to each other. "Do you ever wonder," Little Sparrow asked one such evening, "what our lives would have been like if we had been able to stay together all those years ago? If there had been no barriers between us, no separation?" James considered this, then shook his head slowly. "I used to wonder that all the time. But now I think perhaps things happened as they needed to happen. You needed to raise your children and live your life with Black Eagle. I needed to build this ranch with Sarah. We both needed to become the people we are now. If we had stayed together as those young, passionate, but inexperienced kids, perhaps it would not have lasted. Perhaps we would have burned out like a fire that burns too hot and too fast." "And now?" Little Sparrow asked. "Now we have something better. We have love that has been tested by time and hardship. We have respect and understanding. We have shared purpose and mutual support. We are not trying to escape reality together. We are facing it together. That is stronger than any youthful passion could ever be." Little Sparrow leaned her head against his shoulder. "You have become wise in your old age, James Thornton," he chuckled. "Not wise, just grateful. Grateful that fate or God or whatever force guides this universe gave us this second chance. Grateful that I found you tied to that rock. Grateful for every day I wake up and see you beside me." As the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, casting their ancient light across the prairie, James Thornton and Little Sparrow sat together in the home they had made. The past could not be changed and the future remained uncertain, but the present, this moment, was theirs, and it was enough. More than enough. It was everything they needed. The land they had fought to protect stretched out around them, safe now from those who would exploit it for profit. The ranch would continue, a bridge between two worlds, a place where understanding could grow and old divisions could begin to heal. And at the center of it all were two people who had learned that love, real love, does not fade with time. It merely changes form, growing deeper and stronger and more resilient with each passing year. Their story would be told around fires on the reservation and in the homes of ranchers for years to come. The tale of the widowed cowboy who found his first love again after more than 3 decades, and how together they stood against corruption and won. But the real story, the one that mattered most, was simpler and more profound. It was the story of two souls who refused to give up, who fought for what was right, and who proved that it is never too late for love, never too late for redemption, and never too late for a new beginning.